Dust tastes like copper and failure. 13 of the deadliest shooters on the planet had already packed up their rifles, defeated by a sliver of steel shivering 4,000 meters away. Wind sheared across the valley, mocking their math, their scopes, their pride. Nobody looked at her. They never did. She was just the silent observer in the corner, nursing a bruised shoulder and a tepid canteen. Then she screwed the plastic cap back on, letting it snap. "Let me handle that." Gravel bit into Caldwell's elbows, though he would never admit it. He lay prone on the shooting mat, his massive frame curled around a custom-built .416, Barrett like a bear trying to nurse a kitten. Sweat cut clean tracks through the dust on his neck, soaking into the collar of his combat shirt. He smelled of old nicotine and rising panic. "Send it," Hayes muttered. Hayes was spotting. His eye was jammed into the ocular lens of a high-powered spotting scope, his thumb rhythmically tapping the side of its tripod. Caldwell exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that betrayed his heart rate. His finger squeezed. The muzzle brake tore the air apart. A concussive wave of heat, dust, and unburnt powder slapped the faces of everyone standing under the canvas awning. Quinn didn't flinch. She sat on a stack of wooden ammunition crates 15 feet back, her boots resting on a cracked plastic cooler. She just blinked slowly, watching the mirage ripple violently over the hot barrel of Caldwell's rifle. It takes roughly 12 seconds for a bullet to travel 4,000 meters. 12 seconds of absolute powerlessness. Once it leaves the muzzle, it belongs to gravity, air density, the rotation of the earth, and the wind. Mostly the wind. Under the awning, 13 men held their breath. Quinn took a sip from her canteen. The water was hot and tasted like plastic. "Trace," Hayes called out, his voice tight. He was watching the vapor trail of the bullet as it disturbed the air, a tiny, fleeting distortion arcing through the sky. High left, dropping. Silence stretched. 10 seconds. 11. 12. A tiny puff of brown dirt kicked up on the hillside opposite the canyon. A microscopic disturbance visible only through the heavy glass. "Impact," Hayes said, his tone flat, devoid of the adrenaline that had carried them through the morning. 4 mils left, 2 mils low. You're in the dirt, Caldwell." Caldwell cursed, his fist coming down hard on the canvas mat. "Bullshit! The Kestrel said the wind was holding at 6 knots, full value." "The Kestrel measures the wind where you're laying, Caldwell," Miller chimed in from the back. Miller was shooter number 4, having failed 2 hours ago. "It doesn't measure the wind in the gorge, or over the riverbed, or up by the ridge." Quinn leaned her head back against the sun-baked canvas of the tent support. Her right shoulder throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache left over from a rough extraction in Helmand 3 years prior. She closed her eyes, letting the voices wash over her. They were all the same. Excuses masked as ballistic science. This was a proving ground. High-altitude desert, roughly 7,000 feet above sea level. The air was thin, which helped the bullet fly further, but the thermal shifts off the canyon floor were chaotic. As the sun heated the rocks, massive updrafts of hot air punched upward, colliding with the cold crosswinds funneling through the mountain passes. It was a washing machine of atmospheric pressure, and they were trying to hit a steel plate the size of a standard doorframe 2.5 miles away. It wasn't just a shot, it was an artillery problem. At 4,000 meters, you had to account for the Coriolis effect, the Earth literally rotating beneath the bullet while it was in flight. You had to account for spin drift, the way the gyroscopic spin of the bullet caused it to drift to the right. You had to calculate aerodynamic jump. They were using tablets, ballistic calculators, laser rangefinders bouncing signals off atmospheric particulate. They were trying to solve the canyon with microchips. Quinn opened her eyes and watched a hawk circling lazily about a mile out, riding a thermal. Its wings banked sharply to the left, catching a shear that was invisible to the men staring at their screens. "Load another," Caldwell growled, racking the heavy bolt of the Barrett. The empty brass casing ejected, clinking hollowly against the rocks. It smelled like burnt sulfur and hot brass. "You're chasing the wind, man," Hayes said, wiping sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of grease across his brow. "It's shifting too fast. We need to wait for a lull." "There are no lulls. Give me a corrected hold." Hayes sighed, adjusting the focus ring on his scope. "Hold right edge. Dial up 3 clicks." Caldwell settled back in. Quinn watched his shoulders. They were tense, trapezius muscles bunched tight up by his ears. He was forcing it. You couldn't force a piece of lead to travel 2.5 miles through a meat grinder of wind. You had to let it find its way. The rifle cracked again. The pressure wave rattled the cheap plastic cooler under Quinn's boots. 12 seconds. "Miss," Hayes said softly. "You shot right through a downdraft, hit short by 50 yards. Caldwell stood up, kicking his shooting mat. The dust bloomed around his boots, coating his uniform in a fine layer of chalky grit. He didn't say anything. He just grabbed his Kestrel meter, shoved it into his cargo pocket, and walked toward the water cooler. Shooter number 7 down. Quinn shifted her weight, feeling the fabric of her uniform pull against the dried sweat on her back. She wasn't here to shoot. Officially, she was an observer, attached to this Joint Forces weapons testing unit as a liaison from Naval Special Warfare. Unofficially, she was here because her command didn't know what to do with a female SEAL who had more confirmed kills in silence than most of their loud, brash officers had in public view. They had shoved her into an administrative testing role to let her recover from a deployment that had ended with 3 of her teammates in body bags and her carrying a titanium plate in her ribs. She hated it here. She hated the posturing. She hated the smell of unwashed tactical gear mixed with cheap deodorant. But most of all, she hated watching bad math. "Who's next?" Hayes called out, rubbing his eyes. His voice was getting hoarse. "Me," a voice said from the back. It was Dawson, Army Ranger. Good shooter, fast. But fast didn't matter at 4,000 meters. Dawson laid out his rifle, a Chetak M200. Heavy, long, designed specifically for this kind of absurdity. Quinn watched the dust devils forming down in the valley floor. They were spinning clockwise. The canyon was breathing. It was exhaling hot air up the slopes. Dawson fired. "Miss." He fired again. "Miss." Quinn picked at a loose thread on her pants, feeling the sun burn through the canvas roof, roasting them all in their own ambition. Hours bled into a hazy, shimmering blur of concussive noise and mounting frustration. The smell of cordite hung thick under the awning, an acrid chemical stench that settled in the back of the throat and refused to leave. Empty brass casings littered the dirt, catching the harsh afternoon light like discarded gold teeth. "Shooter 9, Shooter 10, Shooter 11, miss, miss, miss." The atmosphere in the tent had curdled. The jovial, competitive trash talk of the morning had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, heavy silence. Men sat on ammo crates, staring at the ground, picking dirt from under their fingernails. The metallic ping of cooling rifle barrels was the only sound, aside from the relentless, moaning wind. Quinn hadn't moved from her spot. Her legs were cramped, but she ignored the dull ache in her calves. She was watching the data screens. Hayes had 3 tablets set up on a folding table. They were running state-of-the-art ballistic software. Applied ballistics, Hornady 4 DOF, radar tracking. Every time a shooter missed, Hayes would plug the point of impact into the tablet, run a truing algorithm, and spit out a new firing solution. It wasn't working. The software assumed a linear environment. It assumed that if the wind was blowing 10 miles an hour at the muzzle and 15 miles an hour at the target, it was probably doing something predictable in between. But the canyon wasn't linear. It was jagged, uneven, scarred by millennia of water and tectonic shift. Quinn watched a small cluster of sagebrush about 800 meters out. It was thrashing violently, bent nearly flat to the dirt by a crosswind. But directly above it, a column of dust was rising straight up, completely undisturbed. She rubbed her bruised shoulder, her fingers pressing into the muscle, feeling the knot of scar tissue beneath the skin. "It's the BC," Miller was arguing, pointing a dirty finger at Hayes's tablet. "The ballistic coefficient on these solid copper solids is degraded at this altitude. The software is overestimating their retained velocity." "The software is fine," Hayes snapped back, his patience entirely eroded. "You guys are just pulling your shots because you're tired of getting beat up by the recoil." "Bullshit." "It's not the bullet, it's the transonic zone," Caldwell interjected from his corner, arms crossed. "The projectile is dropping below the speed of sound around 2,800 meters. When it hits that sound barrier coming backward, it destabilizes. It's tumbling before it even gets to the plate." Quinn let out a slow, silent breath through her nose. Caldwell was wrong. She knew the muzzle velocity of the .416 Barrett rounds they were using. She knew the atmospheric density at this altitude. The bullet was staying supersonic well past 3,000 meters. It wasn't tumbling. It was just being pushed. They were looking at the screens. Nobody was looking at the dirt. "Barnes," Hayes said, turning away from the bickering men. "You're up. Let's get this over with before we lose the light." A collective shift occurred under the awning. Posture straightened slightly. Eyes lifted. Barnes was the ghost of the group. Marine Corps scout sniper, a man with graying hair at his temples and skin that looked like cured leather. He didn't talk much. He didn't brag. He had won the King of the 2-mile competition twice. If anyone was going to hit the steel, it was Barnes. He didn't rush. He walked to the firing line with a slow, methodical gait. He laid out a simple, olive-drab shooting mat. He didn't use a massive tactical chassis rifle. He set down a Macmillan TAC-50, a classic. It fired the monstrous .5 OBMG cartridge. Barnes didn't look at the tablets. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, pages yellowed and curled at the edges. He checked his watch. He looked at the sky. Quinn watched him intently. Barnes was good. He understood the fundamentals. He wasn't relying on a microchip to tell him how the world worked. "Spot me, Hayes," Barnes said quietly. His voice sounded like two rocks grinding together. Hayes got back behind the glass. Barnes settled in. He spent a full 2 minutes just dry firing, pressing the trigger without a round in the chamber, testing the brake, checking his natural point of aim. He adjusted his hips, burying the toes of his boots into the gravel to lock his body in place. "Wind is reading variable," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a professional hush. 8 to 12 knots at the muzzle, mostly left to right. Barnes didn't answer. He chambered around. The bolt closed with a heavy, metallic shick that sounded final. Quinn leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. Barnes breathed. His back rose and fell. Once, twice, he fired. The .50 caliber muzzle blast was violent, a physical punch to the chest. Dust rained down from the canvas roof. "Trace," Hayes called. "Good elevation. Holding, holding. 12 seconds. Quinn counted them in her head. 1001, 1002. Impact, Hayes said. He hesitated. Just off the right edge. Missed by 6 inches, Barnes. A gust caught it at the very end. The wind spiked at the target. Barnes didn't curse. He didn't slam his hand down. He just worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the brass, and stared through his scope. Give me a read, Barnes said. Hold 1/2 mil left. Barnes fired again. 12 seconds. Miss, Hayes said, letting out a long breath. High. The wind died completely just over the gorge. You overcompensated. Barnes fired a 3rd time. Miss. Barnes lay still for a long moment. Then, slowly, he opened the bolt, cleared the weapon, and stood up. He picked up his notebook, slid it into his pocket, and looked at Hayes. The canyon is broken, Barnes said quietly. There's no pattern. It's shooting through a blender. Nobody is hitting that plate today. The finality of his words settled over the group like a wet blanket. If Barnes said it was impossible, it was impossible. The testing was over. The 4,000-meter mark remained untouched. All right, Hayes said, standing up and rubbing his lower back. Pack it up. We'll call command and tell them the environmental data doesn't support the shot. Tear down the electronics. Men began moving sluggishly, snapping Pelican cases shut, unthreading suppressors from hot barrels. The smell of defeat was potent, masking even the cordite. Quinn watched them. 13 experts. 13 men who had let the math obscure the reality. They wanted the wind to be a number they could punch into a machine. They wanted the environment to submit to their calculations. She stood up. Her boots crunched against the gravel. The sound was loud in the sudden, depressing quiet of the breakdown. She walked over to Barnes's shooting mat. The massive Macmillan TAC-50 was still sitting there, the action open, a box of heavy brass ammunition resting beside it. She reached down and screwed the plastic cap back onto her canteen, letting it snap. Let me handle that. The tent stopped moving. 13 pairs of eyes turned toward her. They were heavy, exhausted eyes, clouded with heat and failure. For a second, nobody spoke. The only sound was the flapping of the canvas awning in the unpredictable crosswind. Caldwell was the first to break the silence. He let out a sharp, derisive scoff, tossing his ballistic tablet onto a green plastic case. "Excuse me," Caldwell said, wiping his mouth with the back of a dirty hand. "Are you lost, petty officer? The command tent is down the hill." Quinn didn't look at him. She didn't look at any of them. She kept her eyes on the Macmillan TAC-50 resting on the dirt mat. "I said," Quinn repeated, her voice low, devoid of inflection. "Let me handle that." Hayes stepped forward, a frown creasing his sunburnt forehead. "Quinn, look, I know you're bored, but we're done here. Barnes just called it. The wind is too fragmented. The atmospheric layers are stacking unpredictably. It's not a matter of skill anymore. It's a slot machine." "It's not a slot machine," Quinn said. She stepped past Hayes, the toes of her boots nudging the edge of the shooting mat. "You're just looking at the wrong dials." Miller laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, right. The SEAL liaison has the magic eyes. She's going to read the matrix for us. Listen, sweetheart. I don't care what tier you operate in, you can't outshoot physics." Quinn finally turned her head. She looked at Miller. She didn't glare. She didn't offer a dramatic, steely gaze. She just looked at him with the profound, hollow exhaustion of someone who had seen men die because they talked when they should have been watching. Miller's laugh died in his throat. He shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable under her flat, deadpan stare. "Are you done packing your gear, Miller?" she asked, her voice quiet enough that the wind almost swallowed it. Miller swallowed hard. "Yeah." "Then be quiet." She turned to Barnes. The older Marine was watching her closely, his weathered face unreadable. He wasn't mocking her. He was assessing her. "It's your rifle, Sergeant Major," Quinn said to Barnes. "Do I have permission to lay behind it?" Barnes looked from her, down to his rifle, and back up to the steel plate glinting weakly 4,000 meters away in the distorting haze. He slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out a single, massive .50 caliber cartridge, and held it out to her. The brass was dull, the solid machined copper bullet heavy and menacing. "It kicks," Barnes said softly. "And it's dialed for my eye relief, not yours." "I'll manage," Quinn said. She took the round. It was warm from sitting in the sun. "This is a joke," Caldwell muttered, turning his back. "I'm not watching this. I'm going to the trucks." "Nobody's asking you to watch," Quinn said, dropping to her knees. The gravel dug into her knee pads. She didn't adjust them. She lay down behind the Macmillan, sprawling her body out flat. The smell of the rifle was instantaneous and familiar. Hop's No. 9 solvent, baked carbon, and the faint, coppery scent of sweat on the cheek weld. It was uncomfortable. Barnes was taller than her by 6 inches. The stock was too long, forcing her to stretch her neck unnaturally to find the scope's eye box. Her bruised shoulder protested violently as she pulled the heavy buttstock tight into the pocket of her collarbone. A sharp spike of pain shot down her arm, down to her fingertips. She closed her eyes and breathed through it. Pain was just data. It was irrelevant to the task. "Hayes," Quinn said, her voice muffled slightly by her cheek resting against the Kydex riser. "Get behind the glass." Hayes sighed heavily, a long exhalation of pure annoyance. But he sat back down on his stool and pressed his eye to the spotting scope. "I'm on the glass, Quinn. What do you want me to call?" "Nothing," she said. "Don't talk. Just watch the plate." "I'm supposed to read the wind." "I don't want your wind," Quinn interrupted. "Your wind is wrong." She opened her eyes and looked through the Schmidt and Bender scope. The magnification was cranked up to 25 times. The world was reduced to a small, trembling circle of light, 4,000 meters. Through the glass, the steel plate didn't look like a target. It looked like a pixel. It was swimming in a violent ocean of thermal mirage. The heat radiating off the canyon floor bent the light, making the steel stretch and compress, bouncing up and down like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. She didn't look at the reticle. She didn't look at the center cross. She looked at the dirt. She remembered the hawk she had seen earlier, the way it banked. She remembered the thrashing sagebrush and the column of dust rising above it. She slid the heavy bolt back, dropped the .50 caliber round into the chamber, and pushed the bolt forward, locking the lugs in place with a smooth, downward press of the handle. "You're not checking the tablet," Hayes whispered. He sounded genuinely confused now, the annoyance replaced by a professional curiosity. "Tablets measure what is," Quinn murmured, her breathing slowing, her heart rate dropping as the familiar, cold focus washed over her. "You have to shoot what will be." She stared through the mirage. She wasn't looking at the target anymore. She was looking at the air between the muzzle and the target. She was breaking the 2.5 miles into blocks. Block 1, the first 500 meters. Hot, rising air off the gravel. It would push the bullet up. Block 2, the gorge, 1,000 meters of empty space. The wind funneled through there like a jet engine. Right to left. Heavy. Block 3, the opposing ridge. 2,000 meters out. The air hit the rock face and tumbled, creating a vortex. Block 4, the plateau, the final 1,000 meters. The wind was dying there, exhausted by the rocks, leaving the bullet to fall through dead, thin air. If she aimed where the math told her, the vortex at 2,000 meters would grab the bullet and throw it into the dirt. She reached up and turned the elevation turret. Click, 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 click. She didn't count them based on the Kestrel reading. She counted them based on the heat she felt, baking the back of her neck. She grabbed the windage turret. Click, click. She moved the crosshairs entirely off the target. Through the scope, she was aiming at a patch of empty, featureless scrubland, 80 feet high and 40 feet to the right of the steel plate. If anyone looked through her scope right now, they would tell her she was crazy. She was aiming into the abyss. A drop of sweat formed on her eyebrow. It hung there for a second, trembling, before breaking and running down into her eye. The salt stung sharply. She didn't blink. She didn't wipe it away. She let out a breath. The canyon was howling. The wind whipped the canvas awning above her in a frantic rhythm. She wasn't waiting for a lull. Barnes was right. There were no lulls. She was waiting for the rhythm. She watched a dust devil form near the gorge. It spun wildly, picking up red dirt, throwing it into the air. She watched its trajectory. It was moving toward the line of fire. She tightened her finger on the trigger. The trigger was heavy, a 2-stage pull. She took up the slack. The dust devil hit the invisible line between her rifle and the target. It shattered against a crosswind, the red dirt suddenly blowing violently to the left. The vortex had reversed. Quinn's lungs emptied. Her heart paused between beats. She broke the shot. Violence erupted from the muzzle. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical entity that punched the air out of the tent and rattled the fillings in Quinn's teeth. The heavy clamshell brake at the end of the barrel vented expanding gases sideways and backward, kicking up a furious cloud of chalky white dust that coated her arms and the back of Hayes's neck. The recoil was brutal. The Macmillan TAC-50 drove straight backward with the force of a swinging sledgehammer. It bypassed the thin padding of her combat shirt and slammed directly into her collarbone. The titanium plate screwed into her ribcage vibrated, sending a jagged, white-hot spike of agony deep into her chest. Her teeth clicked together, hard enough to taste blood from her own tongue. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her eye remained buried in the shadow of the ocular lens. 1 second, the heavy brass casing had barely settled into the chamber walls, expanding and sealing, before the massive copper projectile was already hundreds of yards downrange. "Trace," Hayes gasped. The shockwave had knocked the breath out of him, but his eye was glued to the spotting scope. His voice was a strained whisper, devoid of the earlier mechanical professionalism. God, you're miles off. High and right. You threw it into the sky, Quinn." 2 seconds. Through her own glass, Quinn watched the vapor trail. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing. A tiny, localized tornado of disturbed air created by a piece of metal displacing the atmosphere at 2.5 times the speed of sound. To Hayes, staring at the linear math, the trace looked like a catastrophic failure. It was arcing wildly toward the barren rock face, nowhere near the steel plate. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. The men who had begun walking away, Caldwell, Dawson, a few others, had stopped. The concussive blast of the .50 caliber had instinctively frozen them in their tracks. They turned, squinting through the dust, looking toward the firing line. They couldn't see the trace, but they could see Hayes. They could see the tension rigid in his spine. 5 seconds. The bullet crossed the 500-meter mark and hit the gorge. The invisible river of wind that Hayes had measured at 10 knots abruptly grabbed the heavy projectile. "Trace is shifting," Hayes said, his voice hitching. The annoyance was entirely gone. Pure, unadulterated confusion took its place. "Wind is blowing it left, hard left. It's dropping." 6 seconds, 7 seconds. The bullet was in the washing machine now. Quinn ignored the stinging sweat in her eye. She controlled her breathing, shallow and slow, fighting the involuntary muscle spasms in her bruised shoulder. She watched the vapor trail get swallowed by the chaotic air over the canyon floor. The bullet was bleeding velocity. It was no longer a laser beam. It was a heavy stone skipping across a violent, invisible river. 8 seconds. It hit the vortex at the opposing ridge. This was the atmospheric wall the software couldn't predict. The crosswind slammed into the jagged limestone face and folded over itself, creating a massive downdraft. "It's diving," Hayes choked out. His fingers dug into the rubber grips of his spotting scope tripod. "It's diving straight down. It's going into the dirt. You're short." 9 seconds. 10 seconds. Quinn felt the heat of the canyon floor baking the underside of her jaw. She watched the vapor trail disappear into the heavy mirage, distorting the final 1,000 meters. The bullet was exhausted now. It had survived the gorge, survived the vortex, and was falling through the thin, dead air toward the plateau. It was dropping out of the sky at a radical, plunging angle. 11 seconds. "It's back online," Hayes whispered, leaning forward so hard his stool tipped onto its front legs. "It's back on the center line. Elevation is..." 12 seconds. Through the heavy, rippling distortion of the Schmidt and Bender scope, the rusted rectangle of steel looked completely untouched. And then, dead center, slightly favoring the right edge, a tiny, brilliant splash of silver bloomed on the metal. It looked like a star winking into existence. The heavy copper solid had struck the plate with enough remaining kinetic energy to completely vaporize its outer layer, cratering the armor-grade steel and flashing the metal back to a liquid state for a fraction of a millisecond. Hayes stopped breathing. Quinn didn't move. She kept her eye on the glass, watching the microscopic cloud of grey dust settle around the target stand. The impact was visual. The visual was absolute. But the canyon wasn't finished. Silence flooded the tent, heavier and more oppressive than the concussive blast that had preceded it. 13 men stood absolutely motionless, cast in the harsh amber light of the high desert afternoon. Light travels at 186,000 miles per second. The visual confirmation of the hit had reached them instantly, but sound is sluggish. Sound crawls through the atmosphere at roughly 1,125 feet per second. At 4,000 meters, the sound of the impact was still out there, dragging itself across the canyon, fighting the wind to make its way back to the firing line. Quinn slowly slid her hand back to the massive bolt handle. Her knuckles were white. The pain in her shoulder had transitioned from a sharp spike to a dull, throbbing nausea that radiated down into her stomach. Hayes remained glued to the spotting scope. He looked like a statue cast in dirt and sweat. Nobody spoke. Caldwell stood 10 feet away, a pelican case dangling loosely from one hand, his mouth slightly open. Miller was beside him, staring at the back of Quinn's head as if she had just spontaneously combusted. They were waiting. 5 seconds passed since the visual impact. 6, 7. Quinn broke the silence with a mechanical sound. She lifted the bolt handle with the heel of her hand. The action unlocked with a heavy, metallic clack. She pulled the bolt rearward. The extractor claw gripped the base of the massive spent casing, pulling it free from the hot chamber. 9 seconds. 10 seconds. She didn't let the brass eject into the dirt. As the casing cleared the ejection port, she reached over with her left hand and caught it. It was scalding hot. The metal burned into the calluses on her palm, a sharp, searing heat. She gripped it tighter. The pain anchored her. It kept her from floating away into the adrenaline that was desperately trying to flood her system. 11.6 seconds. A sound washed over the firing line. It was faint, ghostly, and incredibly distinct. Tink. It wasn't a loud ring. It was the tired, hollow echo of steel vibrating 2.5 miles away, carried back to them on a shifting breeze. It sounded like a dropped wrench in a distant, empty garage. Hayes let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He slowly pulled his head away from the glass. He blinked, leaving 2 clean rings of pale skin around his eyes where the rubber eye cups had rested. He looked down at his ballistic tablet. The screen was still displaying the failed algorithm. The precise, clean math that dictated the shot Quinn had just taken was physically impossible. He reached out and pressed the power button, turning the screen black. "Center mass," Hayes said. His voice was entirely hollow. 4,000 meters, first round impact. Caldwell dropped his Pelican case. It hit the gravel with a dull thud. "No way," he muttered, shaking his head, taking a step toward the spotting scope. "You're seeing a rock splash. The mirage is tricking you. Let me see the glass." "It's a hit, Caldwell," Barnes said. The sergeant major's voice cut through the hot air like a razor. He hadn't moved from his spot behind Quinn. He hadn't looked through the spotting scope. He didn't need to. He had been watching Quinn's body mechanics. He had seen her read the dirt. Barnes stepped forward. He looked down at the woman lying in the dust. Quinn rolled her hips, sliding her legs to the side, and pushed herself up to a seated position. She moved carefully, keeping her right arm close to her chest. Her face was pale beneath the layer of grime, her jaw set tight. She didn't look at Caldwell. She didn't look at Hayes. She looked up at Barnes. She extended her left hand. Resting in her palm was the scalding, empty brass casing. The neck was scorched black from the powder burn. "Your rifle shoots straight, Sergeant Major," Quinn said quietly. Barnes looked at the brass, then looked into her eyes. There was no arrogance in her face, no gloating, just the profound, bone-deep weariness of someone who had done this too many times in places far worse than a sunny testing ground in the high desert. He reached down and took the casing from her palm. "You read the thermal off the gorge," he stated, not a question, but a confirmation. "The vortex reverses when the thermal off the canyon floor peaks," Quinn said, grabbing her canteen with her good hand. She unscrewed the cap with her teeth, spitting the plastic top into her palm. "Your software is trying to average the wind speed. You can't average a wall of air. You have to wait for the wall to break and shoot through the crack." She took a long swallow of the hot, plastic-tasting water. It did nothing to clear the copper taste of adrenaline from the back of her throat. Miller stepped forward, his face flushed red beneath his sunburn. "That was a lucky pull. You yanked the trigger when the wind died. It was a statistical anomaly." Quinn lowered the canteen. She looked at Miller. The absolute stillness in her eyes made him falter. "Do you want me to do it again, Miller?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine inquiry. It carried the terrifying weight of someone who fully believed they could replicate the impossible, simply because it wasn't impossible to them. Miller opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. He looked at the dust settling around the heavy Macmillan rifle. He looked at Barnes, who was quietly slipping the spent brass casing into his pocket. Miller took a step back and shook his head. No, Barnes said, answering for the group. He reached down and grabbed the heavy bipod legs of his rifle, folding them up. We're done here. The data is compromised. We're packing it in. Quinn nodded slowly. She pushed herself up to her feet, ignoring the sharp protest of her ribs. She didn't brush the dirt off her uniform. She didn't linger to soak in the stares of the 13 men who were now looking at her not as an administrative nuisance, but as an apex predator who had just walked into their cage and eaten their meal. She turned and began walking back toward the stack of wooden ammunition crates. "Hey!" Caldwell called out, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. It sounded thin, almost desperate. "How did you know? The hold? The elevation? How did you know where to put the crosshairs without the math?" Quinn stopped. She didn't turn around. She looked out at the canyon. The wind was howling again, whipping a fresh dust devil across the gorge, erasing the invisible path her bullet had taken. "Math tells you how the world is supposed to work," Quinn said over her shoulder, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "The dirt tells you how it actually works. Start looking at the dirt." She walked back to the cracked plastic cooler, sat down heavily, and closed her eyes, letting the canyon wind dry the cold sweat on her face. The silence under the awning was absolute, save for the sound of 13 men quietly, methodically, packing away their broken instruments. Diesel exhaust smells like burnt plastic when an engine is running too hot at high altitude. The smell seeped through the floorboards of the up-armored Suburban as it violently navigated the switchbacks leading down from the testing plateau. Tires chewed over rutted limestone, sending bone-jarring vibrations straight up through the cracked vinyl seats. Quinn sat in the back, wedged between a stack of Pelican cases and a spare tire that smelled of hot rubber. She was completely, perfectly still. But inside, her nervous system was tearing itself apart. This was the tax. Adrenaline is a magnificent liar. It convinces the body it is invincible, numbing torn muscle and masking bone-deep exhaustion. But when it leaves abruptly, creating a vacuum that is immediately filled by a cold, shivering nausea. Her right shoulder wasn't just throbbing anymore. It had locked into a stiff, necrotic ache that radiated up into her jaw and down to her fingertips. The titanium plate in her ribs felt like a block of dry ice pressed against her lung. Every time the heavy SUV hit a pothole, her breath hitched, a sharp, involuntary hiss escaping her teeth. She shoved her hands under her thighs to hide the tremors. Her fingers were vibrating. In the driver's seat, Hayes kept his eyes fixed on the treacherous, winding dirt road, but his gaze flicked to the rearview mirror every 30 seconds. He was watching her. He had been watching her since they packed the trucks. The mechanical annoyance had completely vanished from his demeanor, replaced by a nervous, almost desperate curiosity. Caldwell sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the plunging drops into the gorge. He hadn't spoken a word since the firing line. His heavy tactical chassis rifle was secured in the back, right next to Quinn's boots, a very expensive piece of useless metal. The Kestrel was pulling a 7-knot average, Hayes said suddenly. His voice was loud in the confined space of the cab, startling over the roar of the strained engine. Nobody answered. I'm running the math backward in my head," Hayes continued, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. If the thermal pushed the round up, the drop-off over the gorge should have caused a catastrophic loss of elevation. You held high, right? You had to hold high. Quinn leaned her head back against the cold glass of the window. The vibration rattled her skull. "Hayes," Barnes's voice came over the encrypted comms radio sitting in the center console. The sergeant major was riding in the lead vehicle, but he had keyed his mic. "Shut up and drive." Hayes snapped his jaw shut. The radio clicked off. Quinn closed her eyes. She didn't want to explain it to Hayes because she couldn't. How do you explain that you didn't calculate the wind, but felt it? How do you teach someone that true environmental awareness isn't born on a flat range, but in the chaotic, blood-soaked dirt of a botched extraction? Her mind drifted back to Helmand. 3 years ago. The smell of copper blood mixing with the chalky Afghan dust. The deafening, rhythmic whomp, whomp, whomp of the medevac rotors kicking up a blinding brownout. The math had said the LZ was clear. The drone feeds had said it was safe. The tablets had shown green. But the math couldn't measure the desperation of a young kid with an RPG hiding in a spider hole just outside the thermal sweep. The math didn't account for human panic. She had learned that day, lying in the dirt with a shattered collarbone and a dying teammate bleeding out over her boots, that the instruments lie. They provide a false sense of security in a world governed by chaos. If you trust the screen over your own eyes, over the dirt, you die. That was why she had taken the shot today. Not to show off, not to humble Caldwell or Miller, but because watching 13 men blindly trust a broken algorithm had made her stomach physically turn. It was a reflex. The Suburban hit a massive dip in the road. The suspension bottomed out with a violent metallic crash. Quinn couldn't stop the gasp. She doubled over slightly, her left hand grabbing her right bicep, her forehead dropping toward her knees. The pain was blinding, a brilliant white flash behind her eyelids. Caldwell turned his head sharply. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the pale, sickly sheen of sweat on her forehead. He saw the way her breathing was shallow, rigidly controlled to avoid expanding her ribcage. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't ask if she was okay. He was a professional. He knew what a broken body looked like, holding itself together by sheer willpower. Caldwell reached out, turned the dashboard AC vents away from himself, and pointed them directly backward into the rear cab. He cranked the fan to high. The air was stale and lukewarm, but it was moving. Then he turned back around and stared out the window. Quinn slowly sat back up. She let the lukewarm air hit her face, drying the cold sweat on her cheeks. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The silence in the truck had shifted. It was no longer the heavy, arrogant silence of the morning. It was the solemn, bruised quiet of men who had just realized the depth of what they didn't know. Fluorescent tubes buzzed with a sick, erratic frequency inside the Tactical Operations Center. The TOC was a massive, climate-controlled tent erected on a concrete pad at the base of the mountain. It smelled of stale coffee, ozone from the humming servers, and the sharp, chemical sting of dry erase markers. To Quinn, stepping out of the wild, howling canyon and into the sterile, artificially lit tent felt like stepping onto an alien planet. Major Collins stood at the head of a folding table, flanked by 2 junior officers. Collins was a logistics man. His uniform was immaculate, his boots free of the red canyon dust that coated everyone else. He had soft, uncalloused hands that currently rested on either side of Hayes's ballistic tablet. Captain Reed, the weapons program director, was pacing behind him, chewing on the end of a plastic pen. The 13 shooters had filed into the tent, exhausted, dirty, and silent. They stood in a loose semicircle around the table. Quinn hung back near the tent flap, leaning her good shoulder against a metal support pole. The canvas was cold against her back. "The data is corrupted," Collins said flatly. He tapped the screen of the tablet. "The Doppler radar shows a complete loss of tracking at 2,200 meters. The acoustic sensors registered an impact on the plate, but the software shows a 0% probability of a hit based on the environmental variables. "The sensors didn't lie, Major," Hayes said. He was leaning over the table, a stark contrast to his earlier defeat. "It was a confirmed center mass hit. We had visual and acoustic." "By an unassigned shooter," Collins countered, his eyes flicking up to look at Hayes. "A naval liaison who isn't even on the testing roster. Who authorized Petty Officer Quinn to take a turn on the firing line?" Silence dropped over the room. The bureaucracy had entered the chat. It didn't matter that a human being had just accomplished the ballistic equivalent of a miracle. What mattered was the spreadsheet. What mattered was liability, funding, and the structural integrity of the testing protocol. "I did," Barnes said. The sergeant major stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer gravity of his presence commanded the room. He walked up to the folding table and dropped the heavy, scorched .50 caliber brass casing onto the plastic surface. It landed with a loud, authoritative clack. "The program is designed to test the limits of extreme long-range ballistics, Major," Barnes said, his eyes locking onto Collins. "We found the limit. The limit is the software. The rifle is capable. The ammunition is capable. Your algorithm is not." Collins frowned, his brow furrowing in irritation. "Sergeant Major, you know how this works. We need repeatable data. If the software can't predict the environment, we can't build a firing solution for the warfighter. A lucky shot by an unauthorized observer doesn't give us a tangible metric." "It wasn't luck," Caldwell spoke up from the back. Quinn turned her head slightly. Caldwell was leaning against a stack of MRE boxes, his arms crossed. He looked exhausted, his ego thoroughly pulverized, but his voice was steady. "She called the wind shift without a meter," Caldwell said, looking directly at Collins. "She read the thermal drop over the gorge. The math said the bullet would dive. She knew the vortex would reverse and hold it up. You want a tangible metric. The metric is that your screens are blinding your shooters." Collins let out a long, patronizing sigh. He picked up his dry erase marker and uncapped it. "Listen, gentlemen, I appreciate the theatrics, but Congress isn't funding intuition. They're funding the ballistic computer program. If I put in my report that our state-of-the-art tech failed and a Navy SEAL had to use feelings to hit the target, they'll pull the budget." Reed stopped pacing. "So we scrub the shot." "We log it as an anomaly," Collins corrected smoothly. "An unverified acoustic trip. We reset tomorrow. We wait for the atmospheric conditions to stabilize, and we rely on the data." Quinn felt a cold, dark amusement bubble up in her chest. It was the same old story. Men in clean uniforms, sitting in air-conditioned tents, rewriting reality to fit their neat, sterile narratives. They would rather fail cleanly on paper than succeed messily in the dirt. She pushed off the metal pole. Her boots scuffed against the plastic flooring of the tent. Everyone turned to look at her. She didn't march up to the table. She didn't demand recognition. She simply walked past the group, her face pale, her right arm hanging limply at her side. "Petty Officer," Collins barked, his voice sharp with sudden authority. "We are in the middle of a debrief." Quinn stopped near the exit flap. She didn't turn around to face him. She just looked down at her own hands. There was a smear of black carbon on her thumb, grease from the heavy bolt of the Macmillan. "Debrief the tablet, Major," Quinn said, her voice dry and rasping. "It's the only thing in here you're listening to anyway." "Excuse me." Collins took a step forward, his face flushing. "You are attached to this unit as an observer, Quinn. You overstepped your bounds today. Do not compound it with insubordination." Quinn finally turned her head. She looked at Collins. She saw the spotless uniform. She saw the soft hands. She saw every officer who had ever signed a mission manifest based on flawed intelligence. every bureaucrat who viewed the men and women on the ground as data points on a probability curve. "You can scrub the shot," she said softly. The quiet in her voice made the men in the room hold their breath. "You can delete the acoustic log. You can tell your brass whatever you need to tell them to keep your funding." She reached up with her left hand and pushed the heavy canvas flap of the tent aside. The cool evening air rushed in, carrying the scent of wild sage and cooling rocks. "But tomorrow," Quinn said, her eyes shifting to meet Caldwell, then Miller, and finally resting on Barnes. "When they lay back down in that dirt, they're going to know your math is a lie, and they're going to know why they're missing." She stepped out into the dark. The tent flap fell shut behind her, cutting off the harsh fluorescent light. Out here, the canyon was silent. The wind had died down, leaving the high desert still and cold. Quinn walked toward the medical tent, her boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel. She didn't care about the record. She didn't care about the 4,000-meter mark. The shot had never been for them. It had been for her. She needed to know that despite the titanium in her ribs, despite the nightmares that woke her up tasting copper, despite the brass writing her off as a broken liability, she still knew how to read the dirt. She was still lethal. She reached the medical tent, pushed through the flap, and sat down heavily on a sterile, paper-covered cot. The crinkle of the paper sounded loud in the empty space. "Need an ice pack, petty officer?" an older medic asked, emerging from the back with a clipboard. Quinn looked down at her right shoulder. The fabric of her shirt was trembling slightly from the muscle spasms underneath. "Yeah," she breathed, closing her eyes. "And a roll of tape. I need to wrap it tight. I'm going back up the mountain tomorrow." Frost covered the hoods of the idling Suburbans like pulverized glass. It was 0600. The high desert air was thin and bit deep into the lungs, smelling of crushed sage, cold limestone, and unburnt diesel particulate. Quinn stood near the rear bumper of the lead vehicle, rotating her right shoulder in slow, agonizing microcircles. Beneath her combat shirt, a thick lattice of rigid zinc oxide tape bound her clavicle tightly to her scapula. The older medic had painted her skin with tincture of benzoin before laying the strips down. The sharp, pine tar chemical stench still clung heavily to her collar. The tape felt like a localized straitjacket. It didn't erase the pain, but it contained the terrifying, unstable looseness of the damaged joint. Every time she inhaled, the tape pulled at her skin, a sharp reminder of the toll yesterday had taken. Major Collins stood near the open doors of the Tactical Operations Center tent, flanked by his two junior officers. He looked entirely out of place in the dawn light. His uniform was crisp, the creases sharp enough to cut paper. He was holding a plastic clipboard, tapping a pen against the metal clip in a rapid, agitated rhythm. "All right, listen up," Collins barked as the 13 shooters gathered loosely around the vehicles. His voice carried a forced, brittle authority. Yesterday's data collection was severely compromised by environmental anomalies and unauthorized deviations from protocol. Today we reset. We are sticking strictly to the matrix. If the Doppler loses the track, or if the Kestrel registers a wind spike above 10 knots, you hold your fire. We are not guessing. We are logging repeatable data. Nobody said a word. The men just stared at him. Their faces were hollowed out by fatigue and the lingering ghost of yesterday's humiliation. Caldwell stood a few feet away from Quinn, holding a dented aluminum thermos. He unscrewed the cap, the metal grinding loudly in the quiet morning, and poured a stream of steaming, pitch-black coffee into the cup. He didn't look at Collins. He took a sip, grimaced at the bitterness, and then held the cup out toward Quinn. She looked at the coffee, then at Caldwell's face. The arrogance that had defined his posture 24 hours ago was completely gone. In its place was the raw, stripped-down exhaustion of a man who had realized his entire religion was a lie. Quinn took the cup. Her fingers brushed his heavy leather gloves. "Thanks," she rasped. The hot liquid burned its way down her throat, settling uncomfortably against the icy knot of dread in her stomach. "Load up," Collins ordered, turning on his heel and walking back into the TOC. "Firing line goes hot in 45 minutes. The drive up the mountain was silent. The Suburban's heater blasted dry, suffocating air into the cab, but it couldn't touch the chill settling over the men. Quinn sat in the back, her eyes closed, feeling the heavy vibration of the tires eating up the rutted dirt road. When they reached the plateau, the canvas awning was already snapping violently in the wind. The canyon hadn't magically reset its physics overnight. The crosswinds were already howling through the gorge, kicking up swirling vortexes of red dust that danced mockingly over the drop-off. Hayes set up the folding table. He pulled the ballistic tablets from their protective cases and hit the power buttons. The screens glowed to life, crisp and blue, demanding absolute obedience. "Who's first?" Hayes asked. His voice was entirely neutral. He wasn't making eye contact with anyone. Caldwell walked to the back of the Suburban. He unlatched his heavy Pelican case and pulled out the custom point .416 Barrett. The weapon was a beast, a hyper-engineered piece of modern warfare designed to eliminate human error. He carried it to the firing line and laid out his mat. He didn't pull his Kestrel wind meter out of his pocket. Collins emerged from the command vehicle, walking up to the firing line with his hands clasped behind his back. "Remember, Caldwell, we need a clean data stream. Wait for the software to give you a green light firing solution before you break the shot." Caldwell lay down in the dirt. He racked the heavy bolt, chambering around. The metallic shick-clack sounded loud and final over the moaning wind. Quinn sat on the same stack of wooden ammunition crates. She cradled her right arm against her stomach, the throbbing in her shoulder a steady, heavy drumbeat. She watched Caldwell settle his breathing. "Target acquired," Caldwell muttered, his eye pressed to the scope. Hayes looked at the tablet. "I'm painting the target. Wind is erratic. 6 knots at the muzzle, jumping to 12 at the gorge. The software is calculating a severe downdraft. Hold 2 mils high, 3 mils left." Caldwell didn't move his turrets. He lay absolutely still. "Caldwell," Collins snapped, stepping closer to the mat. "Did you hear the spotter? Dial your elevation. The software is showing a sinkhole over the ravine." Quinn watched Caldwell's jaw clench. She watched his right hand release the pistol grip of the rifle. He reached down and grabbed a handful of the dry, chalky canyon dirt. He squeezed it, feeling the texture, the weight of the particulate. Then he slowly opened his fist, letting the dirt sift through his fingers. The wind caught the dust instantly. It didn't blow straight back. It curled, whipping in a tight clockwise spiral before being sucked abruptly upward toward the sun-baked rock face on their right. Caldwell watched the dust. He wasn't looking through the glass. He was looking at the world. "Cancel the hold," Caldwell said quietly. Hayes paused. His finger hovered over the tablet screen. "Confirm." "Cancel the hold, Hayes," Caldwell repeated, his voice dropping an octave. He settled his hand back onto the pistol grip. "The thermal is bouncing off the limestone. It's creating an updraft, not a sinkhole. If I hold high, I'm throwing it over the mountain." Collins's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "Shooter, you are out of protocol. The Doppler data clearly indicates a pressure drop. You will follow the mathematical solution, or you will clear your weapon and step off the mat." Silence hung under the awning. 13 men watched the standoff. Caldwell didn't argue. He didn't yell. He simply closed his left eye, deburying his focus entirely into the scope. He reached up and dialed his elevation down. 2 heavy, audible clicks. He was holding low. He was deliberately aiming below the steel plate, 4,000 meters away, betting that the invisible hand of the canyon would catch his bullet and carry it upward. "Fire when ready," Hayes whispered. He had pushed the tablet away. He was looking through his analog spotting scope. Caldwell breathed out. The heavy muzzle brake shattered the morning air. Dirt rained down from the canvas roof. The concussive wave hit Quinn in the chest, vibrating against the titanium plate in her ribs. She didn't flinch. She just kept her eyes on Caldwell's back, watching the muscles in his neck tense against the brutal recoil. 12 seconds. The air under the awning felt suffocatingly heavy. Major Collins stood rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed furiously on the back of Caldwell's head. The Major was waiting for the miss. He needed the miss. He needed reality to conform to his spreadsheets. "Trace," Hayes called out, his voice tight. "You're low, coming through the gorge. The crosswind is catching it." 6 seconds. Quinn closed her eyes. She didn't need a spotting scope. She could feel the temperature of the air on her face. The morning sun was violently baking the limestone ridge. The thermal updraft was there. She knew it was there. 8 seconds. "It's climbing," Hayes breathed, his voice cracking slightly. "The trace is rising. It caught the thermal. Elevation is correcting." 10 seconds. Collins took a half step forward, his pristine boots crunching on the gravel. "Impossible," he muttered, almost to himself. 12 seconds. Through his scope, Caldwell watched the steel plate. For a fraction of a heartbeat, nothing happened. The canyon remained a blurry, shifting canvas of heat mirage and red rock. And then, low and left, just grazing the bottom corner of the rusted rectangular target, a brilliant flash of silver erupted. It was a marginal hit, a ragged, ugly strike on the very edge of the metal. But it was a hit. The sound wouldn't reach them for another 11 seconds, but Caldwell didn't wait for it. He slowly opened the bolt. The heavy, smoking brass casing ejected, spinning through the air and landing in the dirt by Collins's boots. It hissed softly as the hot metal burned into the dust. Hayes exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He slowly reached out and closed the cover over the ballistic tablet. The screen went black. "Impact," Hayes said quietly. "Bottom left corner. 4,000 meters." Collins stared at the smoking brass at his feet. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The pristine architecture of his testing protocol had just been violently disassembled by a handful of dirt, and a man who had finally decided to open his eyes. "Anomaly," Collins finally choked out, his voice sounding thin and weak over the wind. "Log it as an unverified anomaly. The radar didn't track the full flight path." Caldwell stood up. He didn't look angry. He just looked incredibly tired. He slung the massive Barrett over his shoulder and looked directly at the Major. "You can log it however you want, sir," Caldwell said, his voice stripped of all its former bluster. "But I know what I saw, and I know why it hit." He turned and walked away from the firing line, past the folding tables, past the expensive tracking computers, and headed toward the trucks. One by one, the other shooters began to move. Barnes stepped up to the mat, laying down his Macmillan. Miller took a spot behind him, pulling out a battered paper notebook instead of his phone. They were talking to each other in low voices, discussing the dust, the temperature, the way the mirage was boiling off the rocks. The tablet sat on the table, dark and ignored. Quinn remained seated on the ammunition crates. The cold ache in her shoulder was excruciating, but the tight knot in her stomach had finally unwound. She wasn't going to shoot today. She didn't need to. Her point had been made, carved into the rusted steel 2.5 miles away, and cemented in the minds of the men currently lying in the dirt. Collins turned sharply, his face a mask of bureaucratic fury, and marched back toward the command vehicle. He was retreating to his spreadsheets, to the safe, sterile world where numbers always behaved. Barnes chambered around. The heavy click echoed under the awning. Quinn reached over with her good hand and picked up her canteen. She unscrewed the plastic cap, took a slow, deliberate sip of the stale water, and leaned her head back against the tent pole. She closed her eyes, letting the violent, unpredictable wind of the canyon wash over her face. It smelled like dust, hot brass, and the quiet, undeniable truth of the physical world. She let out a long, silent breath, and for the first time since she had arrived in this wretched desert, she felt entirely at home. The math will always tell you how the world is supposed to work, but the dirt tells you how it actually bleeds. If you felt that shot, if you know what it's like to trust your gut when the machines are lying to you, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to stop looking at the screen and start reading the wind. Drop a comment below. What's the one instinct that saved your life when the plan fell apart? Subscribe for more gritty, grounded stories from the edge of human endurance. Stay sharp out there.